This is a production of PBS Charlotte.
This week on Off the Record, national test scores after COVID show CMS is either losing ground here in the classroom or gaining ground compared to other school districts, or maybe both. And then there's the Charlotte Transportation Center, above ground or underground, or how about overground? At City Council, more battery-powered buses coming soon, and what can we learn from other cities about affordable housing? In politics, Sherry Beasley's getting support from former President Obama, but Ted Budd's getting more support in the polls. And if you're a school board member running for re-election, don't count on any support from the Black Political Caucus. Plus, how the little races in Charlotte this election year could make a big difference in Raleigh next year. Lots to talk about next on PBS Charlotte. And from our PBS Charlotte studios in historic Plaza Midwood, I'm Jeff Sonnier, and we're off the record talking about the stories you've been talking about this week. And if you watch the news, read the news, and listen to the news, well, you'll recognize the names and faces around our virtual table. Eli Portillo from the UNC Charlotte Urban Institute, Danielle Shemtob from Axio Charlotte, and Jenna Contino from the Charlotte Observer. You can also join the conversation at home or from your phone. Just email your questions and comments to offtherecord@WTVI.org. Let's start this week with education. If you're a parent and your child comes home from school with a report card that puts them near the top of the class, and then you find out the entire class is failing, do you feel good about that, or do you feel bad about that? That's kind of the situation that CMS is in this week as they hear back results of the latest numbers in what's known as the Nation's report card. Eli, you're kind of the resident parent on our group here. As a parent, when you see numbers that kind of send a mixed message like this from CMS, what's your reaction?
Well, I think there are two ways of looking at the data that were released this week. One is that CMS did better than the average for large cities and many of its peers on reading and math scores for 4th and 8th graders. But if you look within CMS, performance has declined. And more concerning even than an overall decline, I think, is that the racial gap, especially between black and white students, really widened. So, you can look at it and say, gee, Charlotte, CMS is doing better than some of its large urban peers, doing better than the average, but that average isn't great. And to me, it's the performance gap and that achievement gap that is widening, unfortunately, and is actually worse than it was a couple decades ago, which indicates to me there's really movement in the wrong direction when it comes to equity.
Yeah, I know a lot of the focus on the test scores is on reading, but math numbers were kind of interesting in this particular report. It showed that among the 20 and 25 or 30 school districts measured, CMS had the highest performance when it came to 8th grade math scores among all the school districts, but it also showed that the actual measurement itself was about 30%, and the number of Hispanic and African American students, their performance was below 20%. So, if you're a parent in Charlotte, if you're number one, but your kids are still struggling, if they're still falling behind, especially after COVID, it's hard to get excited. It's hard to put a smiley face on this one, I suppose.
Yeah, and when you look back at 2019, I believe the math proficiency total was over 41% then. So, falling more than 10 percentage points in 3 years is pretty big decline. And I know we're going to talk a little about the school board later, and I think that this, of course, factors into that. The other factor you mentioned is COVID. Obviously, with remote learning and educational disruptions, that was a big factor. And I think it's important to look beyond just remote learning. It appears that had an impact, but there's also a lot of instability around remote learning. For example, many of the kids who were in remote learning but didn't have access to good internet connections, that's lower income, more often Black and Latino kids. So it's not just being out of school that was so deleterious here. I think it's also what happens when you're out of school and who has access to the resources to mitigate some of those effects or not.
Yeah, and while all the school systems had issues with, COVID and remote learning, I thought it was interesting. One of the things they brought up in a CMS briefing on these numbers earlier this week was that it looks like remote learning was that older kids did better with remote learning. The 8th grade scores generally were higher than the 4th grade scores. And again, these are being measured after COVID when kids are finally getting back to school. But it looks like the remote learning might have had a bigger impact on those younger kids in particular, than the 8th graders and the older high schoolers. I guess that's a lesson learned, but it does raise the question of what impact will it have on the upcoming school board election. School board's pretty much held responsible for what happened during COVID in terms of remote learning, rightly or wrongly. Can we talk a little bit about perceptions in the community, regardless of these numbers, of who's responsible for the fall off in learning numbers, and if these incumbents are going to be hurt by this?
I think the achievement gap is the biggest issue in the local election. And you see from these various groups, even coming from different political perspectives, from groups like Moms for Liberty to the Black Political Caucus to the African American Faith Alliance, that are concerned about the impacts, and maybe in different ways, but concerned about the impacts of remote learning and kind of how that affected the achievement gap. Of course, worth noting that I think the pressure has been on the school board for a number of years around the achievement gap. We go through this song and dance, it feels like every year in the last couple of years, around whether the county is going to fully fund CMS, and that is largely driven by a desire for more accountability around the achievement gap.
Yeah, and if you talk about who's being held accountable, well, CMS did get rid of the superintendent. Ernest Winston was pushed out early, and they have interim in now with a nationwide search underway. So I think you already saw the school board itself, trying to say, hey, we're holding someone accountable for this performance and all the issues we've had. One problem I think that comes up with the school board is there's not necessarily any district or model that's doing fantastic right now among large urban districts. CMS is according to this at close to the top, but those numbers, as we talked about, are not great. So there's a lot of, I think, questions about, okay, you want a clean house, you want a new board. If you're a voter out there, that's what you want. Is there anyone out there who has a great answer? And that is a tough question.
Yeah.
It's a larger problem than just CMS, but at the same time, I think we have an interesting history here that has played into all of this, around the fact that we were a model for desegregation in the 80s, and once that was reversed, now CMS, I believe this was as of a couple of years ago, is the most segregated school district in the country. I'm sorry, not in the country, in the state. So I think it factors into all of these issues that we're talking about, and there are unique challenges that CMS has to deal with, but they are certainly challenges that school districts across the country also face. But our history is really important to understanding where we are now.
Yeah, and that kind of brings us back around to that Black Political Caucus story on endorsements. Not a single incumbent running for re-election this year was endorsed by the Black Political Caucus, and that suggests that that leadership change that happened in the administration on the school system might translate into a leadership change come election day, depending on how impactful those endorsements are. By the way, those numbers that we looked at from that national report card, the school districts that actually did better than CMS, a lot of them were in Florida, which kind of, again, raises the question. Florida opened earlier than most other states, and they put kids back in the classroom earlier than most other states. And while CMS was near the top in a lot of categories, those Florida school districts seem to be at the top in almost all categories. So it does raise the question of, did we make the right call back when when we were in the moment, and what lessons have been learned going forward, and how will the voters react to those decisions, right or wrong, that happened in the middle of COVID. A lot of impactful things happened during COVID. This may be the most impactful thing when it comes to our kids and their education over the next couple of years. But it's an ongoing issue that we'll talk about, I'm sure, in future shows as well. Another issue that we've talked about on a pretty regular basis is the transit system, CATS, and this week we heard a little bit more about their plans for a new transportation center in uptown Charlotte. You know, the more you hear about this project, the less you kind of know about this project, and that's that's the sense we got this week as CATS talked with City Council a little bit about their their choices when it comes to the options available to them. Who wants to take the lead on this one? Anybody? Jenna?
I was just going to say, great scoop on that, Axios. I was actually walking to the transit center yesterday when I saw for something completely different, but I was like, well, let me ask people what they think about the underground, the transit center potentially moving underground. And I really got mixed reactions. There was one man I spoke to who was like, well, I'm from Buffalo, New York, and their bus system was underground, and it was just so much nicer to be out of the weather.
Yeah.
And in the South, I can see this being great when, like, on a really hot, humid day, to just like kind of feel like you're indoors and out of, because even though the transit center is covered, you know, you definitely feel, especially with these buses coming in, you definitely feel that heat and humidity in the summer. And then I spoke to a woman who was telling me, I don't feel safe with this transit center now, how it is. Like, if we move it underground, I feel like that's an opportunity for, I don't know, more crime to happen, perhaps. So it was interesting, the different perspectives I heard, and I just wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah, those were some of the issues brought up by CATS this week as they talked about the different options. I think Axios had a story about not just the original two options, underground and above ground, but kind of that third hybrid option, right, Danielle?
Yeah, so we reported basically that CATS is moving forward with the underground option. They're not really considering just rebuilding it at the street level, but there is a third alternative, which I guess since they ruled out the other one is really the second alternative, which would be to kind of rebuild it on two levels, the street level and like an upper level that would connect with the Blue Line. So that was interesting. I think the major downside that they said of that third option is that it would take some of the land they're trying to use. The developer they're working with, White Point, owns a parcel across the street that they want to use as a temporary transit center while they're, constructing the new one. And I believe what they were saying was that it would take some of that land up as the major downside. But I think it's important to look at, part of the reason that they want to not just kind of tear it down and rebuild the same thing is they're trying to address crime, right? And I think there have been questions about, well, will that address crime? Is it helpful to put it underground? His argument was, if we have one level, we can monitor it, it would be easier to actually kind of keep an eye on than two levels. And then, of course, the weather aspect. And, it's the development aspect it cannot be understated, right? I mean, the whole part of the plan is that they want to have this mixed use tower that this will be a part of, and having that street level retail is a big part of the plan.
Yeah.
So I think they're balancing a number of interests. It sounds like they've heard a variety of feedback. They've engaged with a couple hundred riders, I believe, and they had one last meeting on Thursday. So we'll see kind of how that input weighs into the final plans.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about the development in a second, but Eli, you're part of the Transit Time blog, and I know there's been some experience in other cities with this underground concept when it comes to crime. I know that CATS thinks it's the safest option, but that's not necessarily what other cities' experience is, right?
Yeah, Denver in particular has gotten, even national attention for some of the struggles they've had with their transit system and safety. The bus drivers union there has said that, it's a very dangerous situation. Their underground transit center has struggled with, petty crime and drug use, people who are homeless staying there for long periods of time. So that's been a struggle. Another issue that I think needs to be addressed is that CATS earlier told City Council they'd be coming back with three options. As Danielle said, now they're going to be coming back with two options. And we don't really have cost estimates yet. So I think that and it doesn't look like we're going to have cost estimates. So I think that you're probably going to see City Council, which has been kind of skeptical of this, continue to pose some questions about how much is it going to cost to bury it versus go above ground? Is this really the best way? And, do we really have an option here? Or is Katz kind of saying like, hey, you should pick this option. We're going to give you another option, but this is the one. So I think that's going to be something you'll hear about at the next meetings on this.
I saw the renderings that Axios had in their story. I thought it was interesting. It was only one rendering, and what you saw were towers, which I assume were apartments or offices or a hotel, and you saw a big retail plaza, and you saw one light rail car and no buses at all. For ostensibly a transportation project. This thing, we talk about it as the transportation center, but, we're talking about a shopping center. I mean, that's what Katz is kind of getting into in partnership for a shopping center and a hotel and apartments. And that's a little bit outside their mission, is it not?
Well, I think that transit is often an economic development driver. That's certainly really attractive for Katz. Also, keep in mind that as the bus system and public transit struggles in general, they're asked to kind of prove, hey, show you're worth it in a way that we don't ask other city departments to. So, Charlotte Water doesn't have to go out and make the case of, hey, we need water pipes. Fund our water pipes, even if they don't pay for themselves. Everyone pretty much accepts we need water and sewer. So pointing to economic development and saying, you're not just getting a bus station. Look, you're getting shiny new towers and retail and apartments and all this good stuff, I think is another way for Katz in particular and transit systems in general to say, hey, we're worth it. We're worth it. Keep funding us, even though we've got ridership struggles. So that you have to think of the bigger picture too.
I think Katz's role as an economic development agency in part too, it goes all the way back to even the construction of the Blue Line. So even predating some of the challenges we've had with the bus system in recent years. I mean, when you talk about when city council or people in the city talk about the success of the transit, of the Blue Line and transit projects, it's often linked to, look at all the development we've seen in South End, as opposed to just look at the, benefit of this light rail we've built. And you see that, that balance, and sometimes they come to a head, right, with whether something is best for economic development or transit. Sometimes they can both marry, but sometimes, like for example, with the Silver Line, they were originally talking about routing it around Uptown. And there was a whole conversation about, is that to sort of spur development, but was that the most convenient for riders? So I think you see that kind of rider convenience versus development come to a head quite frequently within Katz's own history. Yeah, the difference here, though, I think maybe is that, when you go out, the Blue Line extension into areas that need the development, that need the, the impact that light rail can bring. That's one thing. But do you really need help at, a block from Trade and Tryon, to build hotels and shopping centers? It seems to me that the market would go there with or without a new transit center just because it's Trade and Tryon. I guess that's another question for another day and a future discussion as Katz gets closer here. But there's development in places that need it versus development that's already happening with or without a transit center, and I guess that's an issue that council will be discussing at one point as well.
I do want to point out. They're kind of doing a similar approach near the convention center where they're proposing this land trade to kind of redevelop it and make it attractive for hotels to come in. So they have more hotel rooms in Uptown. So maybe the city sees this need. And I know I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but there's less hotel rooms in Uptown than they would like to serve their tourism population.
Yeah, that was on council's agenda this week too. And I know Katz can be an economic driver for housing, theoretically, not just high-end housing, but also affordable housing. And I know, Jenna, you wrote this week about what other cities, at least in particular, what one city is doing that maybe we aren't doing as much of or could be doing more of in the future. Talk about what's happening in Nashville.
Yeah, and I want to preface this with saying when I was writing this, I was very aware this is kind of a smaller level solution. Mm-hmm. This is a situation where one nonprofit's proposal to build one unit of affordable housing turned into 7. And so what happened was a private developer sought out land that was right next to land owned by a nonprofit. He knew they were already planning to build an to build, I think it's like a home ownership. Yeah. Like to build a home there. And he came in and rezoned both of the parcels where they were able to kind of build up, add some density to the project and fit 7 units on the same lot.
So private developers working with nonprofits to kind of expand the inventory of affordable housing through zoning and
right,
and joining
and
properties.
using those zoning laws to add affordability, which I pointed out in the story is something Charlotte's passing of the Unified Development Ordinance might make something like that easier in an area that might have been just for single family homes before.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that. You know, the UDO has been, talked about both good and bad, and its aim is affordable housing. Obviously, it's one of its major aims, but Nashville seems to be, at least on a small scale, an example of how that actually is working, despite the criticism here. Is that something that, could that be the initial impact of the Unified Development Ordinance, that, we'll see these kinds of partnerships that might not have happened before because of the zoning opportunities that are presented?
Yeah, I think it could be. I know that one argument that one side of the political spectrum has is that, this will further gentrification, like bringing in, like building quadplexes, building 4 units on a lot that could have just had a single family home. Like Charlotte's already not ready for the development that's coming in, not ready for the growth. Like we're just opening the floodgates. But I would say the counter argument to that is there's a lot of people needing affordable housing. Yeah. You can't find a unit for under $1,000. So this might make it easier for some people to just have that supply catch up with demand.
It's part of the kind of affordable housing argument that the more density you allow, the more you kind of open up land use. Right. That is, one of the solutions to getting more affordable units. I think the basic economic argument, and I'm probably making it a little oversimplified, but that the city was making when the UDO was being considered, is, if you can build $1 million house on a massive lot, but that obviously is not affordable. But if you could, sell it, you could sell it in as a quadplex. Each one could go for a quarter of that, right? So, I think that's a basic economic argument. Will that happen on such a simple scale? Probably not. I mean, probably developers will get what they can get for the unit. But that being said, I do think that zoning laws, single family zoning laws, were very restrictive in terms of prices and in terms of the density that they allowed, and that did limit kind of what could be built and what what could be charged for that.
Yeah, and I think your story on a small scale showed that some of the pricing for those new units on those now multifamily lots was less expensive than the single family lot pricing. Is that right, Jenna? That some of the new homes were less expensive than the original ones or the standard rates?
Yeah, I want to say, and I might not be remembering correctly, but that the units were going for about $200,000, which I would say when I was doing research for the story, Nashville's housing market is getting as crazy as Charlotte's, where it's really hard to find anything under $300,000. Yeah, this might not be for the lowest income earners that are just really looking for a cheap rental. For someone really starting to look into buying a home, something around the $200,000 mark might be more affordable for a younger family.
Yeah, and you don't know how it affects rental housing too. That's really the low end housing, the affordable housing that most lower income families are looking for, not necessarily to buy, but to rent first. And that's that's another market that's just getting harder and harder to afford these days. Hey, we got 2 minutes left or so. I want to talk a little bit about politics because we're almost to the election. We saw former President Obama endorsed Cheri Beasley this week. No surprise there, but is that a needle mover at all in a race that seems to be tipping towards the Republican side as we get closer to Election Day? Any thoughts on that?
I don't think that endorsement by itself will move many votes. It's hard to imagine someone was on the fence and then they see Obama come in for Beasley and decide to go for her. But that's not really how endorsements work. I think it's more about building momentum and reminding people, hey, this person is out there and affiliated with our party and this formerly successful leader. And also remember, Obama had a big midterm wipeout. It was famously called a shellacking, in his words, I believe. And he's maybe looking around at the national landscape and getting a little more active in this last week, because if you look at a lot of the polling, it looks like the Democrats could be in for another shellacking. So I think that's something to keep in mind with why you're seeing Obama be a little more active lately.
And Danielle, you wrote about the smaller races having big effect in Raleigh potentially next year. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I focused on House District 98, which is up in northern Mecklenburg, and that's incumbent Representative John Bradford. He's the only Republican in Mecklenburg County's delegation, and he has a Democratic challenger, Christy Clark, who's, I believe it's the third rematch for the two of them, and it is mounting a significant challenge. And then one of my colleagues also looked at the state Senate race for District 42, which is Jeff Jackson's old seat, or seat that he's vacating. But basically, both of those are part of a number of districts statewide that on the Democratic side, Democrats are really trying to invest energy into to prevent a Republican supermajority. And of course, Republicans are trying to do the opposite so they can get a supermajority. The Democrats are really making the battle about abortion rights, saying, if the Republicans get a supermajority, they could pass further abortion restrictions and the governor wouldn't be able to veto it. The Republicans are, of course, talking about the typical talking points, inflation, things like that. So, we'll see. But I think there's quite a bit more energy on state legislative races this year than normal because of the landscape. Yeah,
when you look at that small lens and those small races, they don't seem as important, but taken collectively, they can make a lot of difference in Raleigh and probably will make the difference over the next 2 years on a lot of big issues. Hey, we're out of time, but I appreciate you all joining us this week for another great discussion. Thanks for joining us at home as well. You can always send us your feedback, comments, or questions to offtherecord@wtvi.org. We love to hear your emails. And we're glad you're with us every week. We appreciate it. And we'll see you next time right here on Off the Record.
A production of PBS Charlotte.